Good afternoon, everyone. This is Carrie Ward, Director of Policy and Advocacy with the National College Access Network. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is for attendees of our first ever Advocacy Institute, which will be a pre-conference session prior to the NCAN National Conference in Detroit this September. This specific topic is to help prepare our attendees for the difference between lobbying versus advocacy and to help you understand the laws that govern lobbying and advocacy for nonprofit organizations. With that, I would like to introduce our presenter, Justin Beelan from HCM Strategist. HCM Strategist is a group here in Washington, D.C. with wide experience in both lobbying and advocacy for issues on Capitol Hill with the White House and with federal agencies, including the Department of Education. Justin and his colleagues from HCM will be conducting the training at the Advocacy Institute on Sunday, September 18th, and Justin will be leading the webinar today. On a logistical note, if you look at your control tab, you can minimize that using the orange arrow. You can also use the chat box to ask questions. I will be monitoring the question box and will pose the questions to Justin at the end of the webinar. With that, Justin, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, appreciate it, and it's good to be here on the phone, and I look forward to meeting everyone in person in just a few weeks. So today we'll talk about what constitutes lobbying versus what is simply advocacy. We'll talk about direct lobbying versus grassroots lobbying, talk about what a C3 can do versus a C4. I will probably repeat myself quite a bit just to make the points, but hopefully I don't contradict myself either. There have been a lot of revisions over roughly the 100 or so years that we've had lobbying laws and additions, such as the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which ensures that I, because I am a registered lobbyist, have to fill out a bunch of forms 4 times a year. For our purposes, the law dictates how much an organization can spend on lobbying and the 2 categories they can use to determine how much lobbying they are doing. I'm going to give you a lot more information than you probably need to know, which I hope doesn't make this too overwhelming. And the last thing I want to emphasize before we get started is I am not a lawyer. I'm happy to provide advice to anyone who asks for it, but if you're concerned that something might legally cross the line from advocacy to lobbying, again, I'm happy to answer your questions, but I would strongly advise consulting a lawyer. I am lucky enough that in my line of work, I'm close friends with and go running with 2 or 3 times a month a person who's one of the best ethics lawyers in all of D.C. So I'm lucky enough to get some free counsel every now and again, and I've been doing this for, boy, 18 years now. So I like to think I know what I'm talking about. But again, this is a broad overview. If you have specific, really drilled down questions, seek legal counsel. So to get us started, if I can get us started by trying to advance my slide here. That's better. Let's start with a very high-level look at what the difference is between lobbying and advocacy. I'm going to commit a bit of a presentation faux pas here, and I'm going to give you the key takeaway of this entire presentation right at the beginning, and that is that lobbying, by definition, it's an attempt to influence a specific piece of legislation. You're looking at a specific bill before either Congress or the state legislature, and you are looking to influence that, the outcome of that piece of legislation, a specific piece of legislation. Advocacy is a broad range of activities around a certain topic, but it doesn't mention or push specific legislation. I'm going to cover that a few different times in a few different ways over the next half hour or so, and but that's the key takeaway. Lobbying is an attempt to influence specific legislation. Advocacy is creating awareness of a larger issue. Companies and organizations spent about $3.2 billion on lobbying last year. They do this because it works. You can see in this headline here, lobbying is always a pretty sound investment. It tends to be something of a 4-letter word depending on where you are in the country and what your beliefs are, but it works. Companies keep hiring lobbyists and retaining lobbyists and hiring lobbyists to work in-house because it works. It's a very good return on the investment. To kind of already start getting into the nitty-gritty, the IRS offers 2 ways to measure lobbying efforts. One is very, very clear. The other is remarkably almost stunningly unclear. I'll go with the unclear version first, and you can see it here as number 1. 501c3 organizations are only allowed insubstantial lobbying, but the IRS has never quite defined what that means. So many nonprofits over the years have developed this fear that any lobbying is substantial lobbying, and that's just not true. And it's a shame, because just as it's the duty of private citizens to vote and make their opinions known to legislators, so it is with nonprofits. They have the right to speak to their legislation on issues of concern. They have the right to go to their members of Congress and key legislative staff and say, talk about why a piece of legislation is good or bad. And they shouldn't be afraid to do so, but the way the system was set up makes them think that they can't. Luckily, the IRS also offers what is called an expenditure test, also called a Section H. It is simply a one-page form that helps you to estimate how much you can spend on lobbying. I know this is complicated, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The important takeaway is the 501H election is considerably easier. It's actually one of the most simple IRS forms in existence. And the odds are very, very good if you're filling that out, and many of you probably have filled one out. You can lobby more than you think. But before we get into that, we need to talk about what the IRS defines as 2 different kinds of lobbying. I want to get back to something I said earlier, that the amount spent on lobbying is always going up. Correspondingly, the number of lobbyists has gone down since its peak of about 15,000, as you can see in this chart, since 2007. You're probably wondering, how is that possible? How has the money spent on lobbying consistently gone up, but the number of lobbyists has gone down? The reasons are many, but one of them is that more companies and associations are building their grassroots bases to get them involved. The most effective way to get a legislator to care about any issue, and most of you probably know this, is to get a constituent to talk about it, someone who's affected by this personally. That's considerably more powerful than anything a lobbyist can do. So companies and associations are beefing up their grassroots. But depending on how you do it, grassroots lobbying is still definitely lobbying. So to answer the question I asked earlier, the amount of money being spent keeps going up, but the number of lobbyists are going down, because if you do grassroots lobbying, if you organize that way, you don't necessarily have to register as a lobbyist. The money that you're spending is still lobbying money, but you don't have to register as a lobbyist. I also want to make the point at this time, which I probably should have made a little earlier. It's pretty unlikely that you have to register as a lobbyist. Most people on this call, I'm assuming, do not have to register as a lobbyist. I will show you where to find information on how to find out what the requirements are on the state level towards the end of the presentation, because I don't know enough about most individual states to know whether or not you need to register as a lobbyist. But the odds are good you probably do not need to register as a lobbyist. So again, to kind of talk about the 2 different kinds of lobbying, there's direct lobbying, which is when I go to the Hill and I talk to the members of Congress on behalf of a client. And then there's the grassroots lobbying, where I organize folks out in the field to talk to their legislator about a certain bill. And that's the key word. The definition of grassroots lobbying applies to, in the same way that it applies to direct lobbying. If I'm asking my grassroots base or any advocates who want to get involved to talk about a certain legislative issue, specific legislation, that's lobbying. If I just want to create greater awareness of an issue or talk about a broad category of, there's a law that's, we want to promote anti-tobacco rules. I'm not naming specific legislation, but if I just want to say we want to curb smoking, we want to pass legislation that curbs smoking. That's not naming a specific bill, but it's getting people involved. It's educating them on things that might be out there. It's not specific legislation. It's only when I start saying you need to go and write your legislator about HR 5454 that becomes lobbying. A little more information on that, because I know it can be a little vague. I want to emphasize that these rules are very liberal in terms of what does or does not constitute lobbying in either case, and you shouldn't feel the need to write all this down or break out a calculator. Again, under that 501H expenditure test, there are 2 different types of lobbying: direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying. An organization that has made that 501H election may not spend more than 1/4 of its overall lobbying limit on grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying, again, is any communication with a legislator of you about specific legislation. Grassroots lobbying is any communication with the general public that expresses a view about the same specific legislation and includes a call to action. In other words, I want you to call your legislator to talk to them about this bill. I'll give you another example. Grassroots lobbying generally occurs when you state your position to the general public and ask them to contact legislators. But again, it's a very liberal interpretation of grassroots lobbying. You can state your opinion on legislation to the general public as strongly as you want, and it's not lobbying as long as you don't issue a call to action. Again, I can tell my grassroots advocates, we really, really want to increase financial aid spending. As long as I'm not talking about a specific bill, I'm not lobbying. That's a lot on lobbying, so let's get back to the difference between advocacy versus lobbying. Educating lawmakers and elected officials on a given issue is not lobbying. It doesn't need to be logged. It doesn't need to be reported. In this case, you are just simply advocating for your cause. If you talk to your legislators about the importance of financial aid, you're not lobbying. If you talk about the work your organization does, you're not lobbying. Most people, and too many in this town, to be honest, use those words interchangeably, but there is a distinction between advocacy and lobbying that's helpful to understand. When nonprofit organizations advocate on their own behalf, they seek to affect some aspect of society, whether they appeal to individuals about their behavior, they can appeal to employers about their rules, the government about its laws. Lobbying refers specifically to advocacy efforts that attempt to influence legislation. This distinction is helpful to keep in mind because it means that laws limiting the lobbying done by nonprofit organizations don't govern their other advocacy activities. Again, that keyword here is specific legislation. If you're not talking about a specific piece of legislation, it's not lobbying, doesn't need to be logged, doesn't need to be reported. One final distinction that I'm sure some of you already know, if you're a state organization, you are probably doing what is not defined as lobbying or activity, you're doing what is primarily labeled simply as education. And again, education and advocacy can be used somewhat interchangeably. It's pretty loose how people use that term. But you know, advocacy and education are sort of the same thing. Again, as long as they don't touch on specific legislation, you're probably going to be just fine. The really high 50,000-foot view of lobbying is that you should probably assume you're allowed to spend about 10% of your total operating budget on lobbying. By and large, in the the law, and I can talk a little bit about that, the law is a little higher than that, but as long as you're in that about 10% of your total operating budget on lobbying as a C3, you're going to be okay. And of course, if you are a C3, you cannot endorse any candidate for public office. Again, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be repeating myself quite a bit, and this slide is another example of that. But this is it in a little bit more black and white terms. You can do anything. I also want to emphasize here, in case people had this question, you can do any of the things listed on here as a private citizen. As long as you're not wearing your work hat, you can support campaigns, donate to campaigns, endorse any candidate you want on as a private citizen, but you cannot wear your work hat. It's vital, hugely important, that you don't cross those streams. Don't use your work email for campaign materials. Don't give your work email if you make a political contribution. Don't put anything on your work letterhead. Anything under that you can't column in this slide has to be done in your own time, with your own funds, with your own materials, and with a private email address. Let us also talk for a minute about legislator visits, since we are in an election year. The rules can be very, very funny this time of year. The distinction you need to make is the legislator doing this visit as the incumbent? In other words, are they doing it as a public figure, or are they doing it as a candidate for re-election? I will guarantee you that if you are arranging visits with your legislators this time of year, their schedulers are going to ask that question because they have the same legal rules around what they can do too, and they can get in trouble just as a C3 can get in trouble for violating those rules. In most cases, you want to make sure that the legislator is visiting as a public figure or an incumbent, your representative, rather than a candidate. If they come as a candidate, you're subject to very different rules, which basically say, in a nutshell, that you need to invite all other viable candidates for that same office on both sides of the aisle at some point. You have to give equal time to all viable candidates. So if you invite one, you have to invite all of them, unless, of course, you don't invite them as a candidate. You invite them again as a public figure, as that incumbent, as your current representative. They were chosen to speak solely for reasons other than their candidacy. They have to speak in a non-candidate capacity. There actually can't be any mention whatsoever of their candidacy during the presentation or event. Meaning no one can bring campaign posters to get autographed, anything like that. That cannot happen. But again, in most cases, the legislator staff will be well aware of the rules, what they can and can't do. The important thing is to remember, if you're having anybody to visit your facility or anything, your business, make sure that they're coming as the incumbent, as a public figure, as opposed to the candidate. Let's talk a little bit about C4s. C4s are more political entities. That's basically why they're created. In 2010, and I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, in a case that's come to be known as Citizens United, the Supreme Court struck down governmental restrictions on corporations, including nonprofits, spending general treasury funds for independent, what they call independent public communications, that expressly advocate the election or defeat of federal candidates. Basically, it allowed for electioneering communications to be done by C4s. Prior to Citizens United, all corporations, basically, C3 or C4, were prohibited under federal law from engaging in express advocacy to the public. Corporations could spend funds on independent public communications with election-related messages, but they couldn't engage in express advocacy through those communications. They could also communicate with their members, the technical term was their bona fide members, longtime members, on any subject, including advocacy. What the Citizens United decision did was it permitted C4s, and only C4s, to make independent expenditures, but didn't change the limits on political activities imposed by the tax rules. And I should have mentioned probably first that political activities can't be a C4's primary purpose. A C4, you can't create a C4 specifically for advocacy or political purposes, even though it seems like when you look at a lot of the C4s that have been created over the past few years, that's what they've been created for. But technically, it is illegal to have a C4 that's primary purpose is political activities. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the political activity that is done by a C4 is not tax exempt. It may be taxable. The other thing to know about C4s, especially in an election year, is that while they can't contribute to an individual or that individual's PAC, they can contribute to a super PAC. It's one of the reasons why Citizens United was so controversial, and it's also why a lot of C4s seem to pop up every election season since 2010 when Citizens United was put into practice. So I've kind of thrown a lot about you. Let's give some kind of real-world examples in terms of a C3 private, a C3 public, and a C4. These are the three you've got up on your screen: the Annie E. Casey Foundation, San Francisco Foundation, and AARP. Again, in terms of Annie E. Casey, it's C3 private foundation. It's tax-exempt, contributions tax deductible. They cannot do much lobbying. There's a tax on the foundation and managers in terms of any political activity that they do, and any C3, of course, cannot support or oppose a candidate for office. C3 public charity, like the San Francisco Foundation, also tax-exempt, also tax-deductible contributions, limited in their lobbying again, and this is where we come back to that it's insubstantial 501H conversation where they're limited in what they can do, but honestly, it's really not as limited as you'd think. Again, there's that one form which you would fill out to log your advocacy, your lobbying activity. And most of what you're going to do is covered. It's about $12,500 per quarter, or about 20% of your time on lobbying, and that's a lot. It's a very high threshold. And again, the C3, no C3 can support a candidate. AARP as a T4 is completely tax exempt. They can do any amount of lobbying that they want. Some of their advocacy activities, again, may be taxable. But because of Citizens United, electoral activities are considered, they have to be a secondary activity, but they can spend just about whatever they want on those electoral activities. Again, obviously, the AARP is not the main focus of them. Well, it could be argued that maybe their main focus is political advocacy, but in theory it is not. But you know, one of their main secondary activities is political advocacy and uniting their base, and so they spend a good chunk of money doing that. As a C4, they are well within their rights to do so. Quick note on state activities, which I alluded to earlier. State rules differ very much. Here I've got Delaware, Massachusetts, Illinois. That website on the bottom links to the National Conference of State Legislatures web page. As you can imagine, they offer a lot of information in terms of what lobbying you can or can't do in your state. Your state legislature's website will also have all of this information. The thing I'm really trying to illustrate with this slide is that you can see how short the list is of things that you need to be aware of in Delaware as opposed to Massachusetts, and there were some that I couldn't even fit on here. There are others where it's really just a sentence or two about what does or does not constitute lobbying or a lobbyist. It varies widely from state to state. So if you are doing state-level advocacy, again, odds are very, very good you're not going to fall under any thresholds you need to worry about. It's highly unlikely. But do check with NCSL, do check with your state legislature's page, just to make sure you've got all the rules that you need to know memorized. I know that's a lot, and I know I talk fast, and I'm sure there are questions. So I will open it up. Carrie, if you're still with us, and there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Thanks, Justin. I would encourage all of you to start typing your questions in now. Before I get to the questions and to give you some time to think about them and type them into the box, I just wanted to share a little bit about my personal approach to all of this as NCAN's quote-unquote lobbyist. So as many of you know who I've worked with on various policy committees and the rapid response team that NCAN has for our members, NCAN as an organization does engage in some lobbying activities here at the federal level. We will support or oppose pieces of legislation if they fall within our policy agenda. But we do a much greater amount of what Justin described as the advocacy or even just the issues education than we do involvement on specific legislation. So to that purpose, because I know that as our advocacy director that I'm going to be doing this work kind of around the clock, I keep track of my hours just on, roughly on my calendar so that I can make certain that I'm not crossing any thresholds. And even with NCAN's work around the year, keeping in touch with congressional offices, monitoring what might happen on legislation, particularly related to financial aid, I personally spend about 5% of my time in any given quarter on what is lobbying activity that is defined, officially as lobbying. And the general rule, I think, as Justin shared, is that you're kind of looking at, do you hit 20% time? So that's kind of what I look at, and even with everything that NCAN does, I am rarely in any one quarter getting close to that. So I would say that unless you are going to hire a specific policy person who's doing this work day in and day out, that you are most likely not going to trip at least any federal threshold. The link that Justin shared for the state page is crucial. That's a great resource. NCSL has a lot of fabulous state-level resources, and I know many of you are starting to get more involved on state-level advocacy, so you'll want to know what the rules are in your specific state, since you would be more likely to spend more time on state issues necessarily than federal issues. So now that I've kind of given my spiel and shared my approach, let me turn to the questions. I'll hit the logistical one first. Yes, we will share this slideshow. We will also share the recording because as much as we wanted all attendees of the Institute to be here live, a couple of folks did have conflicts. So this recording, the recording is will be available as well. All right, so our first question from Allison in California. How is staff time dedicated to lobbying determined? Is it simply the time spent speaking with a policymaker about the specific piece of legislation, or does it include prep time for the lobbying activity?
It is the former, and that's a great question. It is, as long you're not lobbying if you're just having an internal conversation, discussion about your approach. The lobbying is done specifically when you're talking to that legislator. You get into a little bit of gray area depending on if you're prepping, like, say, let me give you a hypothetical. If I'm doing an advocacy day here in Washington, that I know I'm going to bring a bunch of people to DC and we're going to go up to the Hill and they're going to talk about a specific piece of legislation. The time and the money that I spent planning that event can be construed as lobbying. Certainly the money is. But in terms of just having conversations about strategy internally, that does not need to be logged as lobbying. That's internal strategy. But when you're talking to that legislator, no matter what staffer it is, that absolutely is lobbying.
Great, great answer. Great question, Allison. Something that sometimes I think I maybe err on the side of caution when I am counting hours, but great to hear the difference between what type, whether it is an event or simply research. Certainly here at NCAN, we have a lot of conversations about bills, and on many bills, the ultimate outcome may be we're just not going to take a position. So, we wouldn't count those hours. But so that's a really great clarification question. Next question from Rob in Illinois. Is there any distinction between the amount of lobbying a staff member can do on behalf of an organization versus hiring an outside professional?
Yeah, absolutely. So internally, especially because you are you're doing this internally, you're subject to those rules of the C3. I'm going to answer this probably more simply than I should. When you hire the outside consultant, they are not necessarily subject to those same rules. They're subject to rules that govern lobbyists, hired lobbyists. So there are rules that are different for nonprofits as opposed to the lobbyists themselves. So in other words, I represent a couple of different nonprofits, the Christopher Dana Reeve Foundation, a few other ones. I am not subject to lobbying rules for that nonprofit. I am subject to rules for me because I'm a registered lobbyist. Now, the time that I spend lobbying counts against their cap because I'm representing them. I guess I'm not going to answer this more simply than I thought. I'm going to answer this infinitely more complicated than I thought. My time I'm lobbying on behalf of them, but the way that my hours and the money that they can spend on me counts is different than if they had someone internally. I'm not entirely sure that answers your question, but I hope it does. If it doesn't, re-ask it. I'm sorry.
Justin, that sounded good to me, but I'll ask Rob if there's any additional clarification you need. Please follow up in the window while we're going on to the next question. And this is from Jed in Bottom Line. And it is, Justin, I'm going to read you the question because I think it's going to give you an idea of what is to come in September for the session. And Jed ended this with, maybe we'll cover this in Detroit, but thought I'd ask now. So I would say the short answer is yes, this is what we're going to cover in Detroit. But just to give everyone an idea of where our members are coming from, Jed, who's from Bottom Line, which serves students in multiple states around the country, said they were coming to DC for matter not related to lobbying or advocacy, but since they were going to be here, they decided to book appointments with the elected officials in the states where they have students. So what he's asking is that, this series of meetings ended up mostly being with junior staffers or interns. They were 5 to 10-minute conversations. So he wants to know, do they really listen and use what we provide? Is it a stylized document or a position summary more effective? Other thoughts? Maybe we'll cover this in Detroit.
Oh, we are so going to be covering exactly all of that in Detroit, a lot of it. And the short answer is it varies office to office. The fact that you showed up is by far the most effective thing you can do. I'll have tons and tons of slides full of surveys that have numerous, all congressional staffers basically saying the way to influence us, the way to make us take an opinion on something is to show up. Letters are great, emails are great, social media is increasingly great, which I'll talk about, but to show up, it actually it carries a big difference. In terms of what we call the leave behinds, the packets that you bring up there, the stuff that you leave behind, honestly, I'll throw some information about that in my slides too, since it was brought up. The less the better. More, if you can get your asks down to 1, maybe even 2 pages, they love that. They don't want a whole pile of information, and more of them these days don't want stuff at all. They love the email because you're going to get in this conversation with them and you're going to find out what they're interested in and what it is about your organization that they like. what they like is that follow-up thank you email that you're going to send to have maybe 2 or 3 attachments to it covering the things that you talked about during the meeting, rather than actually bringing something to the meeting. This is a very long way of answering your simple question, which is yes, those things do make a difference. But the fact that you were there makes the biggest difference of all. They're going to remember that.
Absolutely. And I would just add to the part mentioning about the junior staffers or interns. You know, most, especially House offices, they don't have very large staff. So even though you may feel like you're meeting with someone who's 22, that person has the ear of your elected official. And in every session or training that NCAN does, and I know HCM will cover in this first much longer, larger institute, is to know that whoever you meet with, they have the ear, and talking about the fact that this country is secretly run by 25-year-olds is kind of an inside joke here in DC about how elected officials listen to their staff, and their staff work long hours for not a lot of money, so in most cases are pretty young. And it's just kind of the world that we live in, and that's an important part of the preparation for meetings. So thank you, Jed, for that great lead-in. So let's get into some of these other questions. Nate in Colorado is asking about the extent to which 503s can support local or state tax initiatives, school district tax, tax for higher education, et cetera, that are consistent with the organization's mission. Do the same rules, would this be governed by the same rules as a candidate, or might it be more similar to a federal program lobbying for their line items, such as the TRIO program, lobbying for the funding for the TRIO program?
It's a little more like the former, and it sort of depends on if we're talking about if this is a ballot initiative. Again, if it's a specific piece of legislation, the rules that govern lobbying they fully apply. But if it's a ballot initiative, that falls more into the category of education. You can't really take a side on it one way or the other, but you can certainly say, we need more tax money to go to financial aid, we need it to go to this. You can just basically say exactly what it is that the law would do and say we support that without naming the specific law, ballot initiative, anything like that. So if you're talking about legislation, it's definitely lobbying. If you're talking about ballot initiatives, things like that, it's more education, it's more advocacy.
Thank you, Justin. One more technical question from Allison in California. She says if they enter into a lobbying activity in the name of a coalition, do they count the lobbying time toward our specific organization, or does it count towards the coalition? And this is a great question, particularly for the many statewide networks who will be attending the Advocacy Institute, who may gather their members together into a coalition for an issue.
Absolutely, that is a great question, and I probably should have put that in the original slides. The work that the coalition does is separate than the work you do as an individual or as an organization. However, the time that you contribute to that coalition, in other words, if I'm going to an hour-long meeting every week to talk about the latest on these 3 pieces of legislation that the coalition cares about, that technically does count as lobbying. But if the coalition is on the Hill doing the work and you're not there, then that's not your time, that's the coalition's time, and they have their own rules that are set up. They're doing their own filing if they need to do that. That's all them. But again, if you're in meetings, if you're talking about specific legislation in those meetings, this is a little different than when we were talking earlier about how internal planning within your office before you talk to the legislator. This is a little bit of a different animal. Those hour-long meetings they do count for you towards your overall lobbying.
Thanks, Justin. That's a great clarification. And for those specifically who are working with coalitions or who are running statewide networks, please follow up with me if you'd like to get a little deeper into that conversation. For our direct service members, I think you're more likely to be participating as part of the coalition, in which case, as Justin says, when the coalition is out doing the work, you wouldn't need to count that unless you're going to regular meetings. However, if you're a network and you're convening a coalition the way NCAN frequently does, then when I'm doing the work to lead a coalition of our members, or if you're doing state level work to lead a coalition of members in your state, that time would need to count toward you. So that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
We're happy to talk more about that with those folks.
Yeah, and I would actually add one more thing, which is that most of the coalitions that I work with in D.C., they're made up of individual nonprofits, associations, but the leaders of those coalitions, I can't think of a single one that's not actually, are all led by lobbyists, because again, the rules that apply to lobbyists are different than they apply to the nonprofit. So the coalitions will get together and hire a lobbyist, usually one who already works for one of those organizations, to kind of spearhead that coalition, because the rules governing them are a little more open, so they have more time to spend on the Hill. They can devote more work to it.
Yeah, and also the important to note here, whether you're setting up a formal coalition, which does have kind of a formal definition, or whether you're a group of organizations working, towards the same issue, where you might think of yourselves as a coalition, but may not legally fall into that category. So again, we can talk more with anyone who has additional questions about that. And Allison has followed up that she would love to talk more about that, so we can definitely do that. And for those of you who are part of our state leaders call, that can be something that we can add to the topic of conversation there. So I'm not seeing any more questions come in at this time, except Troy from Florida did say this was the best advocacy versus lobbying presentation he's ever seen.
Excellent.
So
excellent.
That was one vote for it being very helpful. So I will just add, I've mentioned a couple of NCAN policy resources. Allison says she can start. So I mentioned the Rapid Response Policy Team. This is a group of NCAN members who basically sign up to agree to get red exclamation emails from me about twice a month, sometimes once, sometimes 3 times, depending on what's happening in Congress or the White House. But this is our first line of defense, first go-to group of members to do a litmus test on legislative issues or policies out of the White House or the department when we need, true to the name, a rapid response on an issue. This team was fabulous during our work with the department last year, responding to the complaints about the FSAID for FAFSA processing, and have been helpful in a number of other issues as well. So for those of you who may be new to NCAN's advocacy work, or this Advocacy Institute is your first dip of the toe into lobbying waters, if you are interested in getting a little more involved with NCAN's policy work, please sign up for that. You just need to send me an email at warickc@collegeaccess.org. I will certainly be mentioning this several times at the conference as well, at the Institute as well, at the membership meeting, but just wanted to throw it out there to those who are on the webinar today. And with that, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we have covered them all for now, but you see Justin's email and Twitter there if you would like to follow up with him, or please keep a list of ideas and topics that we could, that you could ask when we are together in September in Detroit. Part of the reason for this webinar beforehand was to get some of this logistical, less exciting conversation out of the way, but certainly if you have any follow-up questions, we can address them at some point in time when we're together in person as well. So Justin, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you come to the Advocacy Institute and present in Detroit. Have a good day, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate it.